Hey there, Legal Tea listeners. This is your host, Jenny Roselle. We are back to Estate Planning of the Rich and Famous, where we chat about celebrities and their estate planning. Today's episode is on the country music star Hank Williams. And as always, before we dive into what happened estate-wise following his passing, let's talk a little bit about Hank as a person first. According to his Wikipedia page, Hank was born in Alabama on September 17, 1923. And from birth, Hank actually suffered from spina bifida. At the age of 21, Hank married a lady by the name of Audrey Shepard in 1944. About 5 years later, they had a child, and that was Hank Williams Jr. It was shared on the Wikipedia page that Hank developed issues with alcohol, morphine, and painkillers that were prescribed to him for the spina bifida pain. And that really caused a rift in his marriage to Audrey. Just a couple years after Hank Williams Jr. was born, Hank and Audrey divorced. Eventually, he moved to Nashville and met a young lady by the name of Bobby Jett. Hank and Bobby had a child, which we're going to get into in a second because she is a major player in this estate saga that ensued following Hank's passing. But anyway, in a strange turn of events, Hank ended up getting married again. But not to Bobby Jett, but to a lady named Billie Jean Jones, or also known as Billie Jean Horton. Well, I used the word married, but there was question as to whether it was considered a legal marriage. And you see, after Hank passed away, a judge actually ended up ruling that the wedding was not legal because Billie Jean Jones's divorce had not been finalized from her prior husband when she married Hank. And according to Wikipedia, her divorce was finalized 11 days after her, quote, marriage to Hank. And more on that in a bit. So fast forward a mere few months later, Hank passes away on January 1st, 1953 at the too young age of 29 years old. It was tragic and surprising to many, many people. Crazy enough, the daughter he had with Bobby Jett was actually born 5 days after Hank passed away. So let's talk about this kiddo. I told you we would, so here we go. Bobby Jett named the child Antha Bell Jett. But shortly after Antha's birth, Bobby sort of up and left to head to California and left Antha with Hank's mother, Lillian Stone. Lillian ended up adopting the little girl and renamed her Catherine Stone. Unfortunately, Lillian passed away, and Catherine became a ward of the state. About a year later, a couple named Wayne and Louise Dupre adopted her, and yet again, her name was changed, this time to Catherine Dupre. Fast forward many years, Catherine gets married, and she gets married to a gentleman by the name of Keith Atkinson, which is an attorney. And once again, changes her name, but to reflect her marriage, and it was changed to Catherine Atkinson. But the name craziness does not end there somehow. She actually is a musician too, and her stage name is Jett Williams, which sounds like a lovely little nod to her biological mother and father, if you ask me. So, if you ever hear about this case or Hank Williams's family, just know that Antha Bell Jett is the same person as Catherine Stone, which is also the same person as Catherine Dupre, and the same person as Catherine Atkinson, and is also the same person as Jett Williams. That was a doozy. So for the rest of this episode, for ease, let's call her Kathy. So let's get to what happened following Hank's passing. And where do we even start? Yikes. Okay, so for starters, I actually found a handy-dandy little series on Amazon Prime called The Will: Family Secrets Revealed, which is all about estate craziness. So you know that I'll be binging all of those episodes soon. But anyway, in this series, there's a whole episode on Hank Williams' estate. So let's dive into it, shall we? Okay, so it wasn't until many years after Hank passed away, which is when Kathy actually found out she was his biological daughter. In fact, she got tipped off about it on her 21st birthday when her adoptive parents, the Dupreys, mentioned it. But they sort of casually disregarded it. Then, her adoptive dad, who was not well at the time, admitted to Kathy that he thought she should look into this whole thing, that she could be Hank Williams' daughter. At that time, she was 27 years old. So, Duprey, the father, the adoptive father, sent Kathy what he had documents-wise, and away she went on her research. After a lot, and I mean a lot, of time, energy, and effort, Kathy finally confirmed that Bobby Jett was her biological mother, and unfortunately, she found out about this after Bobby had passed away. But confirming her mother was Bobby was ultimately what resulted in Kathy and her attorney/husband, Keith, in learning that Hank was definitely her biological father. Interestingly, how it came to fruition was a sealed with the court custody agreement between Hank and Bobby, laying out custody arrangements for Kathy. Kathy, which is part of and speaks during this documentary that I watched on the Will Family Secrets series, she's actually a part of it. And she said something on it that really maybe stuck with me. She said, quote, "Never did I ever think that I would have a contract that my father entered into with my mother that said, 'I am the father and I want you.'" End quote. That gave me chills to hear and chills to read just right now. She went through so much as a child, and, not finding out who her biological father was so late in life, I'm sure that it was a lot of emotions to process. Okay, so back to the estate stuff. In 1967, an Alabama circuit court judge ruled that Kathy, because she had been adopted, had no rights to make a claim in Hank's estate, according to a Sun Centennial article. But fast forward some time later, specifically in 1985, which was about 20 years later, Kathy said heck with it, and she initiated a case in Alabama and New York, according to a Los Angeles Times article. And ultimately, in 1989, the Alabama Supreme Court, quote, found Kathy had been a victim of fraud and ruled that the estate of Hank Williams Sr. be reopened 15 years after it was closed, end quote. And in the New York case, since that was all about the Alabama case I just referenced, they reversed their prior decision and said that Kathy should be given a jury trial, according to that Los Angeles Times article. But not a lot really is discussed out there about the New York case. So in my judgment, I think a lot of the estate saga and state craziness happened through the Alabama court. Okay, so according to the Will documentary, a 6-year legal battle ensued after Kathy had been determined by the Alabama Supreme Court to be Hank's biological daughter and Hank's estate reopening. And ultimately, what ended up happening? Any guesses? Does it change your guess if I mention that Hank Jr., his mom, Hank's first wife, Audrey, the record companies, all had huge, big-name attorneys and teams leading the charge? Does it change your guess? Well, the answer is the estate got reopened and made Kathy a legal heir of the estate of Hank Williams, meaning she now shares not only in his estate, but his copyrights and royalties, which, to no one's surprise, is worth millions of dollars. Following the legal craziness, the Will documentary shares a brief update on where some of the personal relationships stand. For example, it shared that Hank Jr. and Kathy have actually reconciled, and now they're co-custodians of their father's estate. Beyond the lawsuits directly involving Kathy and Hank's estate, Audrey, Hank's first wife, went toe-to-toe with Billie Jean, Hank's second wife. As one article, a Musicholics article, it's in the source links, don't mind me butchering that, states, quote, following his death, both Billie Jean and Audrey battled over his estate, each one competing over the title of Hank Williams's widow, end quote. And long story short, according to that same article, like I referenced above, and I won't butcher again, the court ruled in 1953 that Hank and Billie Jean's marriage wasn't really valid, even though they, Hank and Billie Jean, considered it to be. And that's why, like on Hank's Wikipedia, for example, she is still referenced as a spouse. And it's because Billie Jean had not been, officially divorced from her prior husband is what made it really not valid. So Audrey sort of ended up paying her off, and Billie Jean got $30,000 to basically say, hey, I give up my rights to Hank's estate and name. And this is probably obvious and clear, but just to clarify, Hank did not have any estate plan. No last will and testament, no trust, nothing. So now that we know the craziness that ensued following Hank's too soon passing, there sure is a lot to take away from his estate. So let's talk about that. First thing to learn, hey, goes without being said, an estate plan sure would have been helpful. I know we have talked about this before on here, but so often, what leads to estate litigation and craziness is because something is missing or something is unclear. Here, we will never, ever, ever, ever know how Hank would have wanted his estate divided because there was nothing in writing telling us. We can assume, but you know what they say about assuming, and assuming is a no-no in my little world. We can't assume. If there's gray area, we often have to get the court involved to have a judge or a jury assist. We knew the opinion of Kathy, we knew the opinion of Audrey and Billie Jean and Hank Jr., all their attorneys, etc., etc., etc. But whose opinion was most important and yet the one we were missing? Hank's. Hank Sr., that is. Second thing to learn is really on the topic of estate planning and adoption. In my little world, when adopted, you sever the legal relationship with your natural biological parents. That means that if a child has been adopted, they cannot go after their biological parents' estate. But I think what makes this whole situation rather unique is Hank, Bobby, and Kathy and sort of the timing and sequence of events. So hang with me here. Kathy was born after Hank passed away. After Kathy was born, Bobby gave her up for adoption. Hank did not. Bobby did, as the sole surviving biological parent. Because Hank was not alive to give his consent or opinion on the adoption, that's what makes things, I think, a little different here. I've not read the court's opinion or transcript, but I know the Will documentary that I watched talked about the uniqueness of things. When the court sided in Kathy's favor as being an heir of Hank's estate, they talked about the unique factors. So I wonder if that's what they hung their hat on, that Hank was not alive when she was born, and therefore he did not technically give her up for adoption. Maybe? Third thing to learn. Sheesh, well, you're never too young to do estate planning. Well, unless you're under the age of 18. But remember, Hank was 29 years old when he passed away. Did he live a little bit of a rough lifestyle? Sure. But that's not always the cause of a way too early death. So dang it, hashtag do your estate plan, people. We never know when it's going to be our time. And it's such a cliche saying, but there's so much truth in it. Okay, let's wrap this episode up. Next week, we are back to a cautionary tale episode where we talk about real life cases, real life clients that I or my office have worked on. During that episode, we're going to be talking about guardianship. And I know we've talked about guardianship a bit on here, like Britney Spears, Amanda Bynes, etc. But I've had some clients recently that were unclear on what a guardianship actually is and what they were supposed to do and not do, etc. So let's make it an episode. Let's talk about it and bring it some awareness. Tune in for next Tuesday, Legal Tea listeners. Until then, take care and be well.